At any rate, I want to thank you all for attending. This is our 7th annual presidential lecture series. So I'm very proud to continue this tradition in 2016 on March 1st. Very historic day in many respects, as we'll mention later with Dr. Mason, March 1st. Our topic tonight is James Knox Polk, Meet America's Most Important Unknown President. A very significant, consequential president, our 11th president, who many people don't know much about, but had a big impact on our history. Before we get started, I want to again welcome you all to being here, and I want to also introduce our presidential guest speaker this year. Dr. Michael David Cohen is our guest speaker, and he earned his undergraduate degree in history and mathematics at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota. And I do want to say something about Northfield, Minnesota, one of the great college towns on the Northern Plains. His alma mater is just literally right down the street from my alma mater, St. Olaf College, two premier liberal arts institutions. So he's from familiar terrain, so I really was happy to kind of reconnect with part of my past as well. It's a wonderful program at Carleton, I can say definitely. Later, he earned his master's and doctorate degrees in history at Harvard University. He's been a stellar young scholar and researcher in the recent years. He's also received his postdoctorate in historical editing, I should say, at Rutgers University as well. Currently, he's an associate research professor of history at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, although he currently lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota as well. In more recent years, he's been working diligently on the correspondence of James K. Polk. You're up to volume 13 and 14, and he's the editor of these final volumes. We do have copies that he has very generously donated. They are on the back shelf of the room up here, along with some other materials from our institute. He's very kindly donated the current 13 or 12 editions, and Dr. Decker's back there too if you're interested in taking a look. So we want to thank him very much for that donation to the university. And he's also donated a copy of his recently published book that treats the impact of the U.S. Civil War on higher education. And we do have a copy of that for our collection as well. So we want to thank him very, very much. Also, one thing Dr. Cohen wanted me to mention, at the end of our session, we're going to have a question and answer session, then open up for the general audience near the end of this hour. But after the event, he alerted me to inform you if some of you may be interested, some of you students, recent graduates, or those who've already finished your programs or in graduate school, there are some opportunities for summer internships in the public sector. He's got several information pages he can share with you after our event, so feel free to come see us later this evening. And with that, we will get started. Dr. Mason, you take the reins. And again, thank you all for coming.
Before we get started tonight, I wanted to thank Dr. Schmaltz for giving our introductions tonight. We'll get right to our program here in just a moment. But I wanted to take this opportunity. Dr. Schmaltz mentioned that the Institute was founded 6 years ago this month, and on March 25th is kind of the day we celebrate that. And today, we're going to kind of just say this is Institute Day. We're going to do it early because we're observing our presidential lecture series today. But today is also another momentous day in world history because it's also J.W. Platt's 70th birthday. And so I would like you to stand up. I want him to be recognized for the treasure that he is. Okay? Because most of us know J.W. And I was going through the records, and despite what some students think, he was not eligible to vote for Polk. And I'm sure he would not have voted for Polk because Polk was a Democrat. So he probably wouldn't have voted for him anyway, right? I'm guessing.
Hardaway actually did vote for Polk.
Actually, he managed the campaign, right? So we wanted to observe that. And as part of this, we wanted to observe the solemnity by providing JW with an official Northwestern alumni shirt because Professor Platt is not only a former professor here and a Fulbright scholar, I might add, that's all right. He's also an alum of the university, so we wanted to give him this. And JW was certainly a very important guy when it came to helping to create the institute and all that. So we just wanted to thank him for all he's done for us.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we're ready to begin.
I was going to add, too, today is Nebraska's birthday, March 1st.
Which one is older?
I'm not
Tennessee
sure.
or Nebraska?
I'm not sure. March 1st, 1867, Huskers, but also Roger Hardaway was telling me earlier today is the 235th anniversary of the ratification of the Articles of Confederation, our first blueprint of government, March 1st, 1781. So a lot of things happening on March 1st. So we're making history today as well. But I'll leave that back to you. I just wanted to point that out. Okay. Look at that. Oop. Need another light.
Yeah, can we have the lights back on to record, please?
It shows up better.
Oh, yeah. Okay. You guys, okay. You
Okay.
go ahead here.
Okay.
We're all set.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Cohen for coming. We started working this out back in October. We both attended a conference in Iowa on presidential politics, and we just kind of hit it off, and we started talking about future projects that we might be able to work out together. So this one came in. So I just wanted to tell you thank you for coming, and I've enjoyed having you here. So very good. In addition, tomorrow I want to invite everybody, anyone that's interested, in room 315, is that right? And Jesse Dunn?
312.
312. We're going to be having, Dr. Cohen's going to come in and talk about careers in public history. You may address that this evening, but there'll be a more specific time in which you can ask him questions in that regard. And he has some, I think, some innovative things to tell us about that. So that'll be at 2 o'clock, I believe, in Jesse Dunn 312. That may come on occasionally. It's part of our ITV issue we have, so just ignore that. All right. First thing I want to ask you is about the Polk project. Tell us a little bit about the Polk project, just very quickly, and how you came for it.
Sure. The James K. Polk project is one of a number of similar projects in the historical field known as documentary editing, which, despite the name, has nothing to do with documentary films, which is what people might think of. A documentary editor's job is to make primary sources, original historical documents, more accessible, more available to historians, students, to anyone really with an interest in history. So a number of these projects are based on individuals and focus on the papers or the letters of those historically important people. There are the papers of Abraham Lincoln, the papers of George Washington, the Frederick Douglass papers, and at the University of Tennessee, I work at the Correspondence of James K. Polk, which is housed in an organization called the James K. Polk Project. The actual letters, the letters that he wrote and that he received during his presidency in the 1840s and earlier, are scattered around at numerous archives. Many are at the Library of Congress, others at the National Archives, at state historical societies, university libraries around the country, and in private hands in many cases. Before the Polk Project began, if people wanted to access those letters, they had to travel around to all these different places, decipher often difficult to read handwriting, faded documents, and in some cases, in the case of those letters owned privately, they just couldn't get to them. So we've taken these, we've located all of the Polk letters, both incoming and outgoing that we can, and we publish them in book form. We transcribe them so that they're easy to read, publish them, and add annotations, identifying who the correspondents were, all of the people who are mentioned in them, institutions, laws, and other topics, so that they're very easy for anyone to read. And like many projects, we've recently gone even beyond this, publishing them not only in book form, but also online. Just the month before last, in January 2016, we actually released all 12 published volumes of the Polk Correspondence online for free. Anyone can access them. They're available through our project's website. And we hope that even more people now will be able to use these original documents. As far as how I came to the project, I received my PhD in history. And I, at the time, didn't really know that this field of historical work existed. So many of us, if we study history, think that teaching is the only career route, but there are actually a number of others. And just as I was finishing my PhD, a job came up at another of these projects for 1 year, the papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, prominent American women suffragists. That was at Rutgers, so I took that job for 1 year and really enjoyed the type of work. Found that it was something I wanted to pursue, and an assistant editorship at the Polk project came up after that, so I moved over there, and since then I've become the editor.
Great. Okay, well, that'll set the stage for our discussions in tomorrow regarding public history and alternative careers that are available in that regard. Let's delve into Polk. We have a picture of him up here. Tell us a little bit about his early background, his early childhood, where he came from.
Sure. Polk was born in 1795 in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. That's where Charlotte is. His parents were fairly successful farmers. They had been successful enough that by the time he was born, they did own some slaves, and were beginning to think about improving themselves by traveling west. So when James was 10 years old, he moved with his family to the western frontier, which at that time meant western Tennessee. They went to an area about 40 miles to the southwest of Nashville, which his father, Samuel Polk, helped to found as the town of Columbia and the county of Maury. So pretty soon, Samuel Polk and his family became pretty prominent citizens. Samuel became not only a farmer and actually a major planter, he came to acquire more slaves over time. He also became a land speculator, buying up land and selling it at higher prices, a merchant, and an important local leader. So James, at that point, was able to get an education because Samuel could afford it better. So he went to a couple academies in Tennessee. Then, when he was 20 years old, he enrolled as a sophomore at the University of North Carolina. Once he graduated from there, he went into law, became a lawyer in Nashville, and soon his father gave him some land, so he became a planter in his own right, growing cotton in western Tennessee and later Mississippi. Then, from his law practice, went into politics, first as a clerk of the state senate, then a state legislator. Then he ended up in the U.S. House for a while, was speaker for 2 terms, and governor of the state of Tennessee, and finally president.
What were the most important early influences on his life in terms of his mentors and people that shaped his political philosophy, primary people?
Probably he had 3 major influences. The first was not so much a person as an institution. When he was at the University of North Carolina, he became involved in the Dialectic Society. At that time, the major extracurricular activity in colleges was the Debating Society, or the Literary Society, where young men, and in later years women as well, would get together and debate topics in history, politics, various other topics that came up in their studies or in public discourse. And Polk became very involved in this as a debater and eventually as president of that society, so he was, in a way, that was his first presidency. He found that he really enjoyed this and apparently was quite good at it, so he seems to have decided at that point to go into a public career. He began that by becoming a lawyer, as I said, right after college, by studying in the office of Felix Grundy, a prominent politician and lawyer who was at that point in Nashville. There were very few law schools at the time, so if you wanted to study the law, you generally worked within the office of a practicing lawyer. Grundy became a good friend of his and a legal mentor. When he retired from the presidency, he actually bought Grundy's old house. That was going to be where he spent his retirement. And it was Grundy who first encouraged him to try to get the job as clerk of the state senate. So that led him into the political career. Once he began in politics, Andrew Jackson became his big mentor. One of the founders of the Democratic Party, the first Democratic president, Jackson kind of took him under his wing and led him through his road through state and up to national office. Polk took on a lot of Jackson's political beliefs, including the idea of the presidency as the representative of the people, that this is the one person elected by all the American people, even though most American people could not vote at the time, and sort of president as the servant of the people. So it was actually Jackson who seems to have led Polk into becoming president. Pretty early on, mentioning it to Polk's wife, and then later to Polk that he should run for the presidency, and Jackson helped orchestrate that election in a way.
What were his religious sentiments or his spiritual inclinations?
Polk was a Presbyterian. His family for generations had been Presbyterians, and his wife was as well, so they worked together in that regard. He was not actually baptized, which is an interesting thing. His grandfather, Ezekiel Polk, had been a deist. He believed in God as a great clockmaker who set the world in motion, then stepped aside. This did not make Ezekiel very popular with the Presbyterian Church, so when Polk's parents showed up with him to have him baptized, right near the beginning of his life, the local minister started questioning his father, Samuel, in some detail to affirm Samuel's faithfulness to the Presbyterian Church. Sam didn't appreciate that. They got into a heated argument, and the minister ended up refusing to baptize James. He ended up being baptized on his deathbed by a friend of his who was a Methodist minister. Polk wasn't a practicing Methodist, but it seems because that friend was a minister, he's the one who did it. Throughout his presidency, Polk and Sarah attended church every Sunday, usually the First Presbyterian Church of Washington. In terms of religion, though, another interesting aspect of Polk is one of his strongest personal beliefs seems to have been in toleration and the separation of church and state. He actually gave some money to support the Mormons as they were traveling on their trek west from Illinois to what would become Utah, which at the time was part of Mexico. He also was very much in support of Catholic rights in a time when Catholics, as the largest religious minority in the country, were very much persecuted by some groups. This actually came out when a Presbyterian minister from Philadelphia came to the White House and was telling Polk, this minister asked for a job and Polk didn't give him one, but he also told Polk that, I don't think you should have appointed Catholics to the army, because Polk had appointed 2 Jesuits to accompany the army to Mexico so that they could perform services for Catholic soldiers and try to convince Mexicans in the Mexican-American War that this wasn't a war against them or their religion. The U.S. would respect their religion. Well, this minister thought that was inappropriate. We have a Protestant country. He should only be appointing Protestants. Polk wrote in his diary he never met anyone he disliked more. He said he called this person a bigot, that this is false religion, that thank God we live in a country where the church and the government are separated, and he will appoint anyone from any religion to a government post.
You oftentimes we think of Polk as being an aggressive war president, and there may be elements of that are factual, but you would say this is maybe a point at which his reputation might be somewhat rehabilitated. And particularly in our modern view, where that view of separation of church and state is important, and the idea of toleration in a pluralistic society is considered a modern value.
Yes, Polk certainly was. This was one of the few times in his diary when you can really see a moral stance. He was very much a business-like person, and in his letters and even in his diary, you usually see him working towards specific goals, but don't get the moral outrage that you see in this case. And it fit with his position as a leader in the Democratic Party, which had very much, Catholics were very much a constituency of the Democrats, so it was understandable that he would have these views and that party would support him.
Of course, we associate him with the Mexican War. We associate him with all things associated with that. What would you say is his greatest singular foreign policy achievement? There are others that you could point to, but what would you say was the greatest of those?
The Mexican War, and more generally the expansion of the geographical size of the country, were really his big accomplishment as president. It was under Polk's administration that the U.S. acquired all of the land from Texas to California, and that the boundary between the U.S. and Canada in the Northwest was finally settled after decades of uncertainty. So under his term, the U.S. actually increased by about 1/3 in size, and on the flip side, Mexico lost half of its territory. And until his term, actually, Texas, as far as the Mexican government was concerned, was part of Mexico, and the panhandle of Oklahoma was part of Texas. So just 75 miles west of here was the Mexican border. People often don't realize how big Mexico was back then. But he led the United States in a war against Mexico that ended up with the U.S. paying $15 million for the entire Southwest from Texas to California. And in 1846, he called on Britain to finally figure out where exactly the boundary is after 3 decades of jointly occupying this region. So many Americans had traveled there that they needed, over the Oregon Trail, that they needed to know who controls which area. So it was under his term that we established the 49th parallel as the U.S.-Canada border.
In that regard, what was his greatest domestic policy achievement, you think?
Well, in a way that is as well, in that that obviously had a big impact on the state of the country. If we exclude foreign relations from its overlap with domestic policy, probably his reform of the tariff. One of his biggest intentions when he came into office was to reduce the tariff. Going into his term, the U.S. had a very high protective tariff, which meant goods imported into the United States were charged really high taxes by the federal government, with the goal being that they'll be too expensive for anyone to buy them, so Americans will buy American. He believed that instead we should have a low tariff, a revenue tariff, so that the government will make some money off of imports, and Americans will be encouraged to buy American to avoid paying that tax, but it won't be prohibitive, so Americans can have their choice of foreign or domestic goods. And very quickly in his term, he and his Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Walker, got that passed. It was known as the Walker Tariff.
What do you think his greatest failure as president was? We always think of him as a president who had one term, and we ought to discuss that. And he pledged to only run on one term. What was did he ever say that there was a particular issue that he didn't accomplish that he wished to?
We do often think of Polk as a very successful president. Actually, in recent political elections that's come up, just last summer, Jeb Bush said that Polk, after his father and brother, of course, was one of his favorite presidents, because Polk said what he was going to do, then accomplished it. In the last election, Mitt Romney's campaign manager said that Polk would be a model for Romney presidency. The reason people think of him as so successful is because of a story that's been printed in many textbooks, that when he took office, Polk set out 4 goals for himself, and he accomplished them all. He did everything he wanted to. Although he did accomplish those 4 things, there's actually no contemporary evidence that he ever limited himself to 4 goals, that he ever said this is what he was going to do. The story began appearing in the 1880s. One of his former cabinet ministers, cabinet secretary, started telling it then. He did try to do other things. He did have failures. The 2 big ones were his attempt in 1848 to buy Cuba from Spain. He, like many Americans, thought Cuba should be part of the United States, and it was economically and politically a very important spot geographically. So he offered Spain $100 million for it, but Spain declined to sell it. His other big failure was, after all this land was acquired from Mexico, he wanted to get Congress to establish territorial governments or state governments for the new land. But he was unable to do that. Congress couldn't agree on whether to allow slavery in the new territories. So during his term, they did not get territorial governments.
You mentioned a little bit about his relationship with Congress. Could you kind of expound upon the nature of the relationship? Did he have, during his presidency, was it divided government? Was it united government in terms of the partisan makeup? And did he have generally a confrontational relationship, or was it more amicable?
During his term, for his full term, the Senate was controlled by the Democratic Party, his party. And during the first half of his term, the House was also controlled by the Democrats. So most of his accomplishments in terms of legislation were in the first half of his term. During the second half, the opposing party, the Whigs, did control the House, so he had a little of a harder time and had to compromise a bit more on some of his policies. This is before the Republicans were around. He had a good relationship with Congress in general, though. He was actually the only president who had been a Speaker of the House before he was president. So he knew very well how Congress worked, and he was able to meet with members of both houses regularly in his office and Sarah Childress Polk, his wife, was very good at organizing simple but effective dinners, which were really political events for James, with Sarah's help, to convince legislators to go along with their policies. So especially during the first half, but really throughout it, he was quite successful in getting Congress to go along with him. Also because he was good enough at keeping his views to himself that a number of legislators in Congress thought that he was on their side when he wasn't, so they gave him things that they might have wished later they hadn't.
Why do you think he stated his intention to only run for one term? Was there any, what do you think is the primary reason for that?
There were a couple of reasons. The first thing to understand in terms of his election is how different the process was then from now. And today is Super Tuesday, and people around the country are voting for the nominees of the Democratic and Republican Party. That didn't happen in the 19th century. There were no primaries or caucuses. The delegates to the National Convention for each party chose by their own conscience who the nominees would be. When the Democratic National Convention happened in 1844, Polk wasn't expected to be a real contender, but they needed 2/3 of the votes in the convention to choose anyone, and no one could get those, so they eventually fell back on Polk as a second choice. 2/3 of them at least could agree to compromise on him if they couldn't get their first choice. I think one reason that he immediately after that said he would serve only one term is because several other Democrats really wanted to be president, and he could get their support more fully if he said, well, hold off for 4 years, not 8. Another reason was that their opponents, the Whigs, had made it a tradition to pledge a single term. 4 years earlier, William Henry Harrison, after being elected president, had said he would only serve one term. He died a month after taking office, so that was a moot point. But this way, sort of the Democrats were on par with the Whigs, so it couldn't be a campaign issue.
Did he deliver any famous orations or speeches? We don't really think about Polk being I can't think of a particular speech that he gave, but was there, did he kind of believe in going public, as the old saying goes with presidents? Or did he pretty much remain kind of the model of the 19th century president, where you were kind of a dispassionate administrator and you just enforced things? Did he give passionate speeches? Because we even had before that with presidents like Jefferson that gave really stirring inauguration in 1801. Is he known for anything like that?
Basically, no. When he was president, he was very much an administrator. He didn't give public addresses as president. During the summer of 1847, he took a big trip through the northern states. So from train stations and at local events, he did give a lot of speeches. And at least according to the Democratic newspapers, he was very good at it. According to the Whig papers, he wasn't. Back then, newspapers were very explicit about their political views. At that time, State of the Union addresses were just messages written to Congress. They were not delivered as speeches. So he gave very effective messages to Congress in that he made good arguments for his policies. Most of the speeches he would have given were before he was president, when he was running for earlier offices. And he's often been called the Napoleon of the Stump, a nickname he supposedly had, that meaning, Napoleon may refer to in part to his short stature, like Napoleon, but also meaning he was very good at speaking on the stump, which was the term then for giving campaign speeches. I've looked into this, though, because that seemed odd to me, because he clearly did not like crowds or public speaking, and I haven't found any contemporary evidence that he was actually called Napoleon of the Stump. That seems to have come into being after he died. So, no, he doesn't seem to have been a very important as a speaker, though obviously he was effective enough to get elected many times.
You and I have discussed this many times. Curious what your perspective is on today. Polk is seen again as kind of a warmongering president, and that he forced Mexico into a war that he felt that the United States could win at the expense of a weaker nation. Do you think that characterization is entirely fair, or is there another way to look at Polk?
Polk would say, yes, there's another way to look at him. To get at the two ways to look at this, it's good to talk about how the Mexican War actually started. The big issue coming into Polk's administration was Texas. In 1836, Texas had declared its independence from Mexico. They fought a revolution in 1835-6, and they won, so we have the Republic of Texas, independent. And in 1845, partly under John Tyler, Polk's predecessor, and partly under Polk himself, Texas was annexed to the United States as a new state. The problem with this was twofold. As far as the Mexican government was concerned, Texas had never seceded from Mexico. The U.S. can't annex it, it's still part of Mexico. And the U.S. and Mexico disagreed over where Texas's border was. According to the Republic of Texas and the U.S. government, Texas ended at the Nueces River. Its southwest border was the Nueces River. According to the U.S. and Texas, it was the Rio Grande. According to Mexico, it was farther northeast at the Nueces River. So Polk, as far as he was concerned, clearly the boundary was at the Rio Grande, and Texas was independent, so it's now American. So he sent a diplomat in the fall of 1845, a few months after he took office, to figure this out with Mexico, to come to some agreement. But Mexico, which had severed diplomatic relations with the United States by this time, refused even to talk to the diplomat. So Polk, in January of 1846, ordered General Zachary Taylor to bring U.S. troops into the most disputed area of Texas, between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. And as far as Mexico was concerned, the U.S. had now invaded Mexican territory, so they fired on them. They killed 13 Americans. This was on April 25th of 46. Polk then came before Congress and he said, war exists. Mexico has shed American blood upon the American soil. And he asked Congress to declare war, or as he put it, to acknowledge that war does exist. People, including Abraham Lincoln, who was a congressman a few months later, actually said that Polk had lied, that this had happened in Mexico, that Polk had sent U.S. troops into Mexico, and thus he'd fabricated the war, as you put it. He had lied to Congress and to the American people in Mexico about what had happened. He forced Mexico into the war. As far as Polk was concerned, it was U.S. territory, so it just depends on which way you interpret what had happened in the 1830s, on where you interpret the border of Texas. Historically, there is better background to support the Mexican view that the Nueces was the Texan border, but Polk and all of the people advising him were certainly unaware of any historical sources that would support that, and were very firm in their belief that it was the Rio Grande.
You mentioned Lincoln. Who were some of the other famous personalities that opposed the war? JQA and people like that. Just comment on that, and maybe some of the resistance that he had. We often have this idea that all American wars have been popular. The Mexican War was very divisive.
The Mexican War, it was certainly very popular in the Democratic Party. Not all Democrats supported it, but the vast majority did. Some Whigs supported it as well, but John Quincy Adams, as you mentioned, was a prominent opponent. A former president, was now in the U.S. House. He's one of only 2 presidents who served in Congress after their terms as president. And he was a really implacable opponent of Polk on many issues, but including the Mexican War. Henry Clay was another very prominent one. He had run against Polk. He was the Whig candidate in 1844 who lost to him. And in 1847, he gave a very well-covered speech by the national press. He gave a speech in Lexington, Kentucky, that really rallied opponents of the war into one of the earliest anti-war movements in American history. So at that point, as public opinion against it begins to be galvanized, and a few months later, Whigs take over control of the U.S. House, Polk begins to see that he's not going to be able to get every goal he wants in the Mexican War, which makes him more amenable to a treaty that might not be his ideal, but will at least end the war with general success.
In terms of his personal life, what was his relationship with his wife, children, things like that?
Sarah Childress had a very similar background to Polk, actually. She was from one of the most prominent families in Tennessee. Her father was a successful planter and merchant, land speculator. Both families were actually friendly with Andrew Jackson. It may well be through Andrew Jackson that they met, that we don't actually know how they did meet. She was very well educated. She attended the academy in North Carolina, which is now Salem College. Women weren't admitted to colleges at the time, but they could at an academy get a very similar education. Moravian Female Seminary was called that, or Moravian Female Academy, rather. She had actually a very equitable relationship with James, in that she was very involved in his political career. It became her job during his campaigns to read newspapers and to tell him what the articles were he needed to read, summarize others that he needed to know about, so he was aware of what's going on throughout Tennessee or elsewhere as he's traveling around giving stump speeches. Then, when he was president, she seems to have been his closest advisor, probably the one person, James, who was a very private individual, would really open up about. In a way, it's unfortunate that they were together for his presidency at the White House because we don't have correspondence between them. So all of these conversations aren't recorded for us to use today. You asked about children as well. They actually didn't have children. He had a surgery when he was 16 that it's possible may have left him unable to have children. He had urinary stones removed without anesthesia or antiseptic, a terrible ordeal. The closest thing he had was brandy. Though we can't prove it, it's possible that's why he didn't have children. When he was president, they did adopt as a ward one of their nephews who had lost both of his parents early in life. By this time, though, that nephew, Marshall T. Polk Jr., was in college. Polk sent him to Georgetown and then to West Point, so they didn't actually raise any children.
Are there any interesting historic firsts we could associate with his time in the White House that can be drawn directly to him?
There are a few. It was during his term in 1847 that the government released the first U.S. postage stamp. Until then, postage was sent postage due. You paid to receive mail, not to send it. And even after they released the stamp, you had the option of sending it postage due, and in most cases, that's how people did it. During his term, it was also when the telegraph was coming into its own. It had been invented by Samuel Morse just a few years earlier. In 1844, the first line had been laid between Washington and Baltimore, and Polk's nomination by the Democratic National Convention, which was in Baltimore, was the first significant news item to be communicated by telegraph, the first item sent by instant communications. It's sort of the road to the iPhone, you could say. Perhaps a little more obscure but still important one is, it was during his term that we get the first government-supported international humanitarian mission. The potato famine was going on in Ireland and Scotland pretty much the same years as his term. It began in 1845, went till 49. Because of the potato blight, the crops were failing over there. The Scottish and Irish people were starving. And the United Kingdom and other European powers just weren't able to give them enough food and supplies. So a lot of American organizations and individuals started sending over goods. And Congress considered a law that we would use federal money to send over support for the starving Irish and Scottish. Polk said that if they passed the law, then he would have vetoed it because he felt charity was an unconstitutional use of tax money. Congress didn't pass the law, but they did pass a similar one, somewhat watered down, that we would use 2 U.S. naval ships to bring over privately donated supplies. These ships, the Jamestown and the Macedonian, would be sent in, given civilian officers and captains, so the Navy wouldn't be directly involved. Polk did sign the law, that was fine with him, and they did bring over a lot of supplies to help people in both those countries, the UK.
Okay, just in summation, what are just one thing that you've learned about Polk that you think makes him a fascinating president and worthy of this type of program? What's something that you've learned from your study that maybe a lot of people don't know about him?
Well, I'd say 2 things. The first, I noticed that this program was titled The Most Important Unknown Presidents, and he really was, largely because of all the land acquisitions during his term. And people have debated many times the wisdom and justice of his actions, especially the war with Mexico, but it's certainly a huge impact on the geography and history of North America. Looking at other topics, I'd say it's kind of ironic, but the most fascinating thing about him is how unfascinating he was. Polk, he was a very dedicated public servant. He believed that it is his job to oversee every aspect of the government. He was really a micromanager, worked long hours in the White House, and seems to have had pretty much no other interests. He did not have hobbies. He really dedicated himself to that one job. So what's so interesting about him is just how hard he worked, and you can see it through his diary and his correspondence. So when he does get to write to his friends, it's usually late at night, and he says, I'm sorry, I wish I had more time, but I have so many public responsibilities to do. And in 4 years, he was able to accomplish more than just about any other president has. So he was very effective, regardless of whether you agree with his policies.
Okay, I think we're ready now to open up for questions. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. Yes, sir.
What was his life like after president?
Very short. Polk had the shortest post-presidency in U.S. history. He left office on March 4th, 1849. And at that point, he took a roundabout route back to his home in Nashville. He went down the East Coast, then west to New Orleans, then up the Mississippi. Along the way, he encountered a number of cholera epidemics in the cities where they were visiting. People on his boat and off the boat kept dying of cholera, so he didn't know whether it was safer to stay aboard or to go off. By the time he reached Tennessee, he had gotten sick. After he got home, he seemed to recover. He said that he completely recovered, but he quickly had a relapse and very suddenly died on June 15th, so just 3 months after he left office. It's kind of sad because as I said, he seemed to have very few interests, but the one topic he kept writing about in terms of personal issues, besides his work as a plantation owner, was this long retirement that he's looking forward to. He bought Felix Grundy's house, was rebuilding a new house after an explosion damaged that one, was very involved in making sure everything was done right so he could enjoy this time. He probably wanted to be a sort of patriarch of the Democratic Party like Jackson had been after his presidency. But then he died almost as soon as he got home.
Other questions?
Did he have any major accomplishments in Congress before the presidency?
Yes, he did. That's a very good question. As I said, he was a supporter, protege of Andrew Jackson. And his time in Congress coincided in part with Jackson's presidency. So he was head of the Ways and Means Committee in the U.S. House when Jackson was fighting his war against the U.S. Bank, this national bank that Jackson and Polk thought was unconstitutional, and Polk played a major role in abolishing that bank. He also was one of Jackson's lieutenants in getting the Indian Removal Act passed in 1830, which led to all Indians east of the Mississippi being the U.S. government negotiating or forcing them into treaties so that they would be moved west of the Mississippi, very often into Indian territory, today's Oklahoma.
So how was his relationship with the tribes during his presidency?
Well, he doesn't actually seem to have been particularly interested in the tribes. He certainly supported removal, but by the time of his presidency, we don't see him write a lot about what's going on. He certainly supports U.S. white immigration to the West, so he considers removal to be very important for that, but doesn't get involved personally with the Indians, which is not to say they don't ask him to. In 1847, I've actually seen 2 letters that we'll be publishing in our next volume from Dakota Indians in what's now Minnesota, where they wrote to him calling him their great father, asking him to intercede on their behalf because they hadn't gotten payments from the government that they were owed according to their treaties, because it was unclear where exactly their borders were with other Indian tribes. So they tried to get the president personally involved, but he sort of left Indian removal to proceed of its own accord, let the Indian Department, which was part of the War Department at the time, handle Indian issues, and didn't step in on his own.
After he gets Mexico, was he on the side of free states or more slave states, or did he just leave that up for Congress to?
He wanted to put that off. He wrote in his diary once, what making peace with Mexico could possibly have to do with slavery, I cannot imagine. He got upset with the people on both extremes. In the North, among people who opposed slavery, there was a lot of support for what was called the Wilmot Proviso. It was introduced by a congressman named David Wilmot from Pennsylvania. It was an amendment that Wilmot and others kept introducing to various bills, saying that any land we acquire from Mexico will be free. There will be no slavery there. It never got passed. People on the extreme other side wanted to be sure that slavery was allowed in all of its territory and wanted to get more territory. Some of them wanted to acquire all of Mexico and make it all slave territory. Polk wanted to push this off, not have this decision about slavery determine whether we're going to get this new land, not have it determine whether we're going to establish territorial governments. That he wasn't able to do that, that Congress was too much divided over the slavery issue, was one of the great failures of his administration. He really tried toward the end of his term to get Congress to create territorial governments for New Mexico and California, but because of this, it didn't happen. He himself certainly was a supporter of the legality of slavery, and he was a major slave owner himself. When he died, he had 57 slaves on his Mississippi plantation. Though he did sort of free them in his will. He said that if he outlived his wife, then his slaves would be free when he died. His wife outlived him by 42 years, so by then slavery was abolished, so it was a moot point.
To what extent was he involved in the military strategy for Mexico?
Very much, actually. He was involved in military strategy more than any president before Abraham Lincoln. The telegraph partly allowed him to do this because communication was very much faster between the U.S. and Mexico than it possibly could have been earlier. But he was constantly in touch with his secretaries of the Navy and of War to help craft the orders that were sent to the military in Mexico. He would carry on a correspondence with those generals that he was on best terms with. Gideon J. Pillow was one of them, an old political friend whom he appointed a general. He also, and this is kind of similar to Lincoln's administration, he kept replacing the general in charge of the armies. At the beginning, it was Zachary Taylor, who, but once Zachary Taylor started doing some things that Polk wasn't happy with, he was a little too nice to the Mexicans. He would let them depart and not really pursue them or establish firm U.S. leadership after a military victory. Polk didn't like that, so he left Taylor down there, but put Winfield Scott in charge of the U.S. armies. Winfield Scott led the major U.S. offensive into Mexico City, but after that, he wasn't so happy with what Scott was doing, partly because he also was too nice to the Mexicans, and partly because both Taylor and Scott were becoming prominent Whigs, so Polk saw them as political opponents. So he replaced Scott with William O. Butler, who finally was a Democrat in charge, so Polk was happy about that. He couldn't direct every little thing that happened because communication did still take a while, but he did everything he could to direct the details of the war.
Sometimes there's discussion about not exactly being able to accomplish what he wanted. If he'd had his free reign at the end of during the treaty-making process, what would he want? What would he prefer to accomplish?
There are probably two changes that he would have made. As I mentioned, some Democrats in Congress were part of the All Mexico movement. They wanted to end the existence of Mexico, take it all into the United States. Polk was not one of them. He was more moderate in that regard. But well, for one thing, if he'd had full reign, he probably would have been happy to pay less to Mexico. They gave Mexico $15 million for this. But the other thing he wanted was to acquire Baja California. And Mexico had two territories of California, Alta California, which included our state of California and a lot of the territory east of it, and Baja California, the peninsula to the south. And he wanted to get that. Mexico wasn't willing to sell, so that he would have gotten as well. For the most part, though, otherwise, he did get what he wanted. The irony, though, is he got it through a commissioner whom he had recalled. He assigned Nicholas P. Trist the job of negotiating the treaty with Mexico, but Trist had done some things that Polk didn't like, including he and Scott had tried to bribe General Santa Anna in Mexico with $1 million, officially to the Mexican government, but basically a large portion of it to Santa Anna himself, to get Mexico's Congress to sue for peace. But this didn't work, and by the time Polk heard about it, he was furious. He ended up recalling Trist, but Trist ignored the recall, stayed in Mexico, kept negotiating the treaty, and Polk wasn't happy about that, but generally was happy about the treaty. He might have turned it down anyway, just because Trist had ignored his order, if Congress hadn't been wigged, because he knew that he had to take what he could get from the Senate when it approved a treaty and couldn't really push for a second try.
You mentioned that he wanted to purchase Cuba from Spain. Was it ever a possibility that he was willing to fight for it, or would he just after they declined, he just left it at that?
He was probably not actually too disappointed that he didn't get Cuba, and he never said anything that I found about going to war with Spain for it. It's interesting, he offered Spain $100 million for Cuba, having spent just $15 million for the entire Southwest, because Cuba was so important. His main concern was that the United Kingdom not acquire Cuba, because Spain was a fairly weak power by this time. He didn't want a more powerful European country to acquire it. Spain declined to sell to the US, but they also declined to sell to Britain. So he was pretty much satisfied. One of the reasons he wanted California was also to prevent the United Kingdom from acquiring it. He didn't want the British to get more of a foothold in North America and block the US in from the West.
Who was his primary correspondence with while he was in the presidency?
Well, the short answer is lots of people. And he, of course, was in touch with other members of his administration, with cabinet secretaries, with diplomats throughout the world. Actually, in 1848, a series of revolutions erupts around Europe. So we have these great letters from all the US diplomats scattered around there about the revolutions going on in Paris and Berlin, and Vienna, and throughout Italy. Events in St. Petersburg and London related to this. He kept up correspondence with smaller U.S. officials all around the country. One of them was Nathaniel Hawthorne, who had begun his writing career by now, but he was also a federal employee. He worked at the Custom House in Salem, Massachusetts, so we have a letter of his having to do with his work there. He corresponded with, I mentioned a couple letters from Native Americans to Polk. We have a few letters written to him from one of his slaves, possibly dictated by a slave to a white person. We don't know whether this slave was literate. Another interesting letter is from a slave, or a free black man who had been brought up to New York while Polk was traveling there during his northern tour. He said that the doctor, this black man from Nashville had been traveling with, had disappeared. So he was worried that this guy would be brought back south and traded into slavery. So he asked Polk, please take me as your servant so that I won't become a slave. Polk did not seem to have responded. So we have letters to him from all kinds of people, because they either they wanted favors from him, or they wanted to express their opinions on public issues of the day. His letters were more often to these important government and military officials and to his family and friends about affairs back in Tennessee and his economic activities, running the plantation in Mississippi. We have his correspondence with his overseer in his plantation there. One of the most interesting letters, and I love to quote this one, is actually an anonymous letter he received during his term about an opponent, from an opponent of the Mexican War. This person just signed the letter, "The Devil." He wrote, "Oh, you bloody hound of hell, you scorpion of the regions of the damned, how do you expect to escape the devil's claws? Yes, he will get you just as sure as your name is J.K. Polk. And as you are writhing in all the agonies of that accursed place, the devil will wear one of his most bland smiles as he punches your damned guts out with a sharp stick." I think this guy was a Whig. And Polk wrote on it, "I will preserve this infamous tirade, and someday the author's identity may be discovered."
It was Lincoln.
After he left his presidency, did he feel that he left it in good enough hands for them to continue on, the nation to continue on, or?
No, he was not happy with Taylor. And Taylor had been his military leader down there in Mexico, but he replaced him. Taylor, as far as Polk could tell, Taylor was a nice old man who didn't know anything about governing. He felt that Taylor would be controlled by other Whigs. And the different factions within the Whig Party would fight over who's going to control the administration, make him a puppet, and then just destroy the party altogether, which would be a good thing in Polk's view of itself, except that he felt the people of the nation would suffer. And he thought Taylor and his behind-the-scenes masters would dismantle all the wonderful measures that Polk had accomplished. No, he was not at all happy with Taylor's taking over. He wrote that for the first time in U.S. history, this would be a regency, and someone behind the scenes would control the president.
Was there anyone in particular that you wish would have been more qualified for the position?
Well, the Democratic nominee was Lewis Cass, a senator from Michigan, and Polk was supportive. In 1848, when the parties were choosing their candidates to succeed Polk, a lot of people wanted him to run again. The Democratic Party also had its factions, and it was increasingly divided partly over the slavery issue. So some people wrote to Polk and said, "You're really the only one who can unite us. We need you to run, or we may lose the election." Some even said, sort of threatened to introduce his name at the convention, even if he didn't want to run again. But he wrote a letter to the convention forswearing any interest in running again. And from his private correspondence to his mother and a cousin and others, you can see he was thrilled to leave. He couldn't wait. He was tired. He wanted to retire. He sent this letter to the convention. It was read on the floor. He didn't express support for any other candidate before then. He said he'd support whoever was the nominee. He did support Cass, and they were friends. He seems to have thought Cass was a good choice, but to Polk's great surprise, actually, Cass lost by quite a bit in that election in the Electoral College.
Speaking of foreign policy, did he have any views, or are there any correspondences concerning the Russian Empire or Russian expansion in Asia or Alaska, or I know out of Oregon country that had been pretty much taken care of by this time, but is there any discussion, do you have any discussion of Russia or affairs with Russia?
There was a little. At this time, Russia had its colonies in Alaska and had earlier for a while run a colony in California. Polk, I've never come across anything where Polk actually wrote about relations with Russia, but we do have one letter from Aaron Palmer, who was a prominent lawyer and a prominent advocate for U.S. trade expansion in Asia and really throughout the world. He wrote to Polk making suggestions about how we should expand trade with East Asia and with Russia, as well as, he mentioned Korea in particular, Japan. So there was some talk about it. No progress was made during the Polk administration in terms of our relations with Russia. But it was on the public mind to some extent. And he is receiving, I should say, he is receiving news from the U.S. minister in Russia, Robert Ingersoll, but in St. Petersburg. But Polk is most interested in hearing what's going on from Russia's perspective toward the European revolutions. There isn't a revolution in Russia. The Tsar really clamps down to make sure there isn't. But Polk is interested in hearing from him as much as from anyone about how the Russian government will respond to European activities in Germany and France.
That's one issue I find really interesting too from a European history standpoint or world history. Is the 19th century was the era of nation building. Here we have the Mexican War. Later we have a war of national unification, the U.S. Civil War. In the 1860s you have Italy, Germany, wars of national unification, big state building. And he's really part of this interesting northern hemispheric process or development. You think about what he did with the size of the country here. And you had mentioned earlier today too about the Department of the Interior was established shortly after his time. So kind of this interesting development, it's kind of global development. He's really part of that. I didn't appreciate it as much until we talked more about it.
Yeah, Polk described the revolution in Paris in 1848 as possibly the greatest event in recent history. He, as well as a lot of Americans, was very happy about the possible expansion of Republican government. The revolutions in 1848 were not ultimately successful. They were overturned in 48 and 49, but he was very hopeful and optimistic about what was going on. At the same time, he and others, even to a greater extent, saw the possibility of secession and a war in the U.S. in future years. And Polk was very much a unionist. He often talked about the importance of preserving our union. That's part of why he tried to be a moderate, as he saw it, on issues such as acquiring territory from Mexico and deciding about slavery there. But ironically, by acquiring all that land during his term, he helped lead the U.S. into secession and the Civil War. It was really this dispute over whether there will be slavery there that helped bring us to war. And toward the end of his term, he wrote in some letters that with all this debate over slavery that's making it so hard to establish territorial governments out there, the harmony and even the existence of the Union is endangered. One of the people who wrote to him several times, actually another anonymous correspondent, a guy who wrote under the pseudonym Amor Patriae, love of one's country, I managed to find out that his name was Andrew Lane, but Polk never knew who he was. He was a southern plantation owner who lived in Connecticut. He wrote that if the Wilmot Proviso were to pass, then that would lead to a civil war. The U.S. would break into two. He thought that everything south of New England would go along with the South, even New York, curiously enough. But, and then, yeah, there would be a war, and it would be on the abolitionist's head. Most people didn't go that extreme, but in this time, we're starting to fear that this will lead to disunion.
Any other questions? Or before we break, I want to encourage all the students who came, if they need to sign a sign-in sheet, to do so on the back. The one for mine is up here on the front, so if you're from my class, you need to come up here, otherwise go to the back. Are there any questions? All right, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I want to thank Dr. Cohen and give him a round of applause. We'll see you next week.